In 1876, the Japanese government made it illegal for a samurai to carry a sword in public. Not restricted, not taxed, illegal. For a warrior class that had ruled Japan for 700 years, this one line of law should have ended everything they were. Why would a nation built by the sword suddenly outlaw it? But the real story is far stranger than a simple ban on weapons. This wasn't the moment the samurai fell. It was the final signature on a death warrant they had already written for themselves years earlier with their own hands. We tend to imagine the end of the samurai as a clash between old and new, a stubborn warrior class crushed by outsiders demanding change. That's the movie version. It's clean, it's simple, and it's mostly wrong. The truth is messier and far more interesting. The samurai who dismantled the samurai were in large part samurai themselves. Let's look at what actually happened. For over 2 centuries, Japan had been sealed shut. The Tokugawa shogunate, a military government led by a hereditary warrior dynasty, kept the country closed to almost all outside contact. Foreign ships were turned away. Foreign religions were banned. A single family had ruled through this isolation since 1603, and inside that sealed world, the samurai held a fixed, comfortable place. They were the only class legally permitted to carry 2 swords, a long blade and a short one, worn together as a badge of rank. They collected rice stipends from their lords instead of working the land themselves. They were technically soldiers, but soldiers with no war to fight, because peace had held so long that most samurai alive in 1850 had never once drawn a blade in anger. Swordsmanship had become closer to ceremony than combat. Then, in 1853, everything cracked open in a single afternoon. 4 American warships appeared in Edo Bay under Commodore Matthew Perry, their black hulls trailing smoke from engines no one in Japan had ever seen up close. Perry delivered a blunt demand: open your ports to trade, or we will return with more ships. The shogunate had no navy capable of refusing. Within a few years, Japan was forced into a string of unequal trade treaties with Western powers, treaties that let foreign nations set tariffs and try their own citizens under their own laws on Japanese soil. The illusion of the shogunate's strength, carefully maintained for 200 years, cracked in public view. Here's the part that surprises people. The men who used this crisis to bring down the shogunate were not peasants or merchants rising up against samurai rule. They were young samurai. Many from domains like Satsuma and Choshu on the southern edge of the country, warriors who watched their own government fail to protect Japan from foreign humiliation and decided the old system itself was the problem. Not foreigners, not modernity, the shogunate. In 1868, after a short but bloody civil conflict known as the Boshin War, these reformers overthrew the shogunate and restored political power to a teenage emperor, Meiji. It's called the Meiji Restoration, but restoration is the wrong word for what came next, because almost nothing was actually restored. No golden age of imperial rule returned. Everything instead was rebuilt from scratch, using Western industrial nations as the blueprint, and the people doing the rebuilding turned their first tools on their own class. Why would the very samurai who had just won a war for the old order start tearing that order apart with their own hands? Because they had seen up close exactly what happened to nations that hesitated. Because they had seen up close that swords could not stop a steamship and that pride could not stop a treaty written by someone else. They understood that Japan would be carved up piece by piece, the way China was being carved up by foreign powers at that very moment, unless the country modernized fast. And modernizing fast meant a national army, a national tax base, and a single centralized government answering to Tokyo. None of that could exist alongside 270 semi-independent feudal domains, each with its own private warrior class loyal to a local lord instead of the state. So it began, piece by piece, quietly at first. In 1869, the domain lords were persuaded, and in some cases pressured, into surrendering their lands and their household registers to the emperor. In 1871, the domains themselves were abolished outright and replaced with prefectures answering directly to Tokyo, in a single administrative stroke that erased 7 centuries of feudal geography almost overnight. Just like that, the local lords who samurai had served for generations, fought for, and in some cases died for, lost their territories entirely. But the samurai, for now, kept their rice stipends. The government still needed their loyalty, or at least their silence. That's not even the strangest part. In 1873, the government passed a national conscription law, drafted largely by a former samurai named Yamagata Aritomo, requiring men of all classes, farmers and merchants included, to serve in a new standing army. For the first time in Japanese history, fighting for the state was not a birthright reserved for the sword-bearing elite. It was a duty of ordinary citizens. Peasants who had never touched a weapon in their lives were suddenly standing in formation, learning to load and fire imported rifles, while samurai who had trained since early childhood in swordsmanship, archery, and horsemanship found their entire monopoly on organized violence quietly erased by a single piece of paperwork out of Tokyo. Picture that moment carefully. A class defined for centuries by its exclusive right to bear arms, watching farmers issued guns instead, and realizing the government no longer needed warriors born to the role. It needed conscripts who could be trained in months. What happens to a warrior class when the state decides it doesn't need warriors anymore? The government still legally owed samurai their hereditary stipends, and by the mid-1870, those payments alone were consuming roughly a third of the entire national budget, an amount the new modernizing state simply could not sustain. So between 1873 and 1876, Tokyo converted the stipends into government bonds, then progressively slashed their value, effectively cutting the income of somewhere around 2 million former samurai almost overnight. Many were forced to sell family heirlooms, take up farming they had no training for, or open small shops just to survive. Some adapted well, many did not. Pride mattered as much as money, though maybe more, and pride is exactly where the final blow landed. In 1876, the Heitorei Edict made it illegal for anyone other than military officers and police to wear a sword in public. By this point, the two swords a samurai carried had never really been about combat effectiveness anyway. They were a visible, unmistakable marker of status, worn every single day as a walking reminder of who ruled and who served. Taking that away in the street, in full view of neighbors and former subjects, was not a policy update buried in some ministry document. It was a public, daily erasure of an entire identity, enforced at the point of a police officer's whistle. Something had to give, and in 1877 it did, in the most dramatic way possible. A former leader of the Restoration itself, a Satsuma samurai named Seigo Takamori, led thousands of aggrieved samurai in open rebellion against the very government he had helped build less than a decade earlier. It's known as the Satsuma Rebellion, and it is one of history's more painful ironies. The man who helped topple the shogunate to save Japan from foreign domination ended his life fighting the modern conscript army that same effort had brought into existence. Government soldiers, farmers and townsmen with only months of training, armed with imported rifles and field artillery, fought pitched battles against some of the finest swordsmen left in the country. The rebellion dragged on for 7 months before it broke. Seigo died in the final stand at the Battle of Shiroyama, and with him died the last organized armed resistance of the samurai class as a political and military force. But here's the twist almost nobody expects, and it's the reason this story doesn't end the way it looks like it should. The samurai didn't vanish after 1877. They didn't fade into poverty and irrelevance the way the story often gets flattened in retelling. Instead, a striking number of them became the architects of the very modern Japan that had just replaced them. Former samurai filled the officer corps of the new national army almost top to bottom. They became bureaucrats, educators, industrialists, bankers, and diplomats. The discipline, literacy, and administrative training that centuries of samurai service had instilled turned out to be exactly what a rapidly modernizing state urgently needed, even after it had stripped that class of every legal privilege it once held. The class had lost its swords, its stipends, and its formal status. It had not lost its influence. Within a single generation, former samurai families were running banks, universities, newspapers, and government ministries instead of feudal domains. So the decision that ended the samurai era wasn't really one decision at all. It was a sequence, tightening year by year: land seizure, then abolished domains, then a conscription law, then stipend cuts, then finally the sword ban, each one removing a layer of what samurai identity had meant, until nothing legally distinguished a former warrior from any other citizen walking the same street. And the people who wrote nearly every one of those laws had themselves once carried the two swords they were now outlawing for everyone else. We still feel the echo of that transformation today, whether we notice it or not. Japan's reputation for disciplined institutions, meticulous bureaucracy, and an almost ceremonial respect for hierarchy in schools and companies didn't appear out of nowhere. It descends, in part, from a warrior class that lost its legal status but exported its discipline into offices, classrooms, and factories instead of battlefields. The bow replacing the blade, the uniform replacing the armor, the company replacing the lord. Even now, when a Japanese corporation talks about lifetime loyalty to the organization, or a martial arts dojo anywhere in the world teaches a student to bow before and after every match. Both are speaking in an accent shaped generations ago, by men who once served a feudal lord instead of a boardroom. Even the word most people associate with the samurai today, Bushido, the so-called way of the warrior, wasn't fully codified as a formal moral philosophy until after the class had already lost its legal power. It was written down, polished, and popularized largely in the decades after 1877, partly by former samurai and their descendants trying to preserve something of who they had been now that the swords, the stipends, and the domains were all gone. The ethics survived the abolition of the class that supposedly invented them. In a strange way, the samurai became more famous and more mythologized after the government made it illegal for them to exist as a legal category at all. In 1876, the Japanese government made it illegal for a samurai to carry a sword. It looked, on paper, like the end of a warrior class. It was actually the moment that class finished building the very nation that no longer needed it to fight.